Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Geneviève Zabriskie. I'm director of the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia, which includes CREASE, and I'm very pleased to welcome you today to the first lecture in our series for the 2016-2017 academic year. And this year we have come up with one theme that actually allowed for a variety of topics, the theme of minorities, broadly understood. You have some of upcoming attractions that I will leave there for now for you to take a look and note the dates. But basically, the lecture series will focus on the fates and the challenges that various minorities face in Eastern Europe, Russia, and Eurasia, from ethnic and racial groups, religious minorities, members of LGBT communities, and also people with disabilities. So the questions we will be investigating throughout the year is, for example, how did the minorities question evolve from the late 19th century, when it was primarily thought about in terms of ethnic and religious identities, develop from the 19th century to this day? Or how do different political regimes come to define groups as minorities, and how do they engage with them as a result? And how is it that some groups actually are defined as minorities but don't understand themselves as minorities? What can the experience of minorities in the region can teach us more broadly? So these are the themes that in several lectures we will develop and discuss together. And today I'm thrilled to have Professor Sarah Phillips to give the first lecture of the year and to officially open that mini-series. Sarah Phillips is Professor of Anthropology and Director of the Russian and Eastern European Institute at Indiana University, so basically Director of their CREASE. Her research specialties are in gender, health, disability, social movements, and identity politics in the former Soviet Union, especially Ukraine. Phillips has published 2 books with Indiana University Press: Women's Social Activism in the New Ukraine, Development and the Politics of Differentiation in 2008. And quickly, she managed to turn over another book 3 years later in 2011, Disability and Mobile Citizenship in Post-Socialist Ukraine, published in 2011. And there's a Russian translation in the works, so that's fabulous news. And she's now currently completing yet another research project on HIV/AIDS in Ukraine, and we very much look forward to a steady flow of publications coming from that research in the future. Today, however, we asked her to discuss the situation of a very specific minority in Ukraine, people with disabilities. And we knew that she came to Michigan 5 years ago when the book first came out, but I wanted her to come back. And we asked her specifically to basically revisit this issue of disabled people with disabilities since the field work she conducted and the publication of that book, and basically bring us up to date to the changes in the situation of minorities, such as people with disabilities. And to our great pleasure, she accepted, and today she will more specifically reflect on how those recent political and economic developments in Ukraine have impacted disability rights initiatives in that country. And she does so by revisiting the subjects, or the heroes, as she calls them, of her 2011 book. She follows their trajectory since she conducted the fieldwork. So we're very privileged, very happy that she accepted to come back. And also, as she was telling us last night at dinner, that the talk today might actually become the preface of the Russian translation for her book. So that's, she's joining this invitation to another set of publications. So we're very happy to have you. So please join me in welcoming Sarah Phillips. And I'm switching, switcheroo. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It is such a delight to be here. I was so gratified by the invitation. So I want to thank Genève and all the colleagues at CREASE and other affiliated institutions here at the University of Michigan for having me back so quickly after my last visit. As she mentioned, it's also a wonderful opportunity for me to do some follow-up research and hopefully integrate that into the translation of my book. You might have a question, why Russian, not Ukrainian, of the book, and it's very straightforward. I wanted a broader readership, and I am very hopeful that people in Russia and Ukraine will read the book and that it could be integrated more broadly into curricula in both countries. So that is why I made the decision to have a Russian translation. So without further ado, I'm going to launch in and really look forward to your questions and comments at the end. And here we go. I actually will pass around the book if that's okay. People might be interested in flipping through, so I'll do that. So in my 2011 book, Disability and Mobile Citizenship in Post-Socialist Ukraine, published by Indiana University Press, I documented some of the significant strides that the disability rights movement in contemporary Ukraine has made in securing rights and recognition for people with disabilities. I argued that in a context of post-socialist changes in social welfare policy and economic reforms and increasingly democratic attitudes towards difference, people with disabilities were finding new ways to articulate themselves as citizens. The book argued that by mobilizing a set of narratives that emphasize both socialist-era attention to collectivism, entitlements, and state support, as well as more individualist, consumer-based narratives privileging self-sufficiency, people with disabilities in post-socialist societies such as Ukraine are enacting a new kind of quote-unquote mobile citizenship to create and access opportunities for rehabilitation, education, and employment. I tracked these processes of articulating identity and citizenship in this post-Soviet state by following the life trajectories of several key informants. People with disabilities with different class, gender, age, ethnic, regional, language, and educational backgrounds. The book outlined ways that people living with disabilities leverage social relationships in NGOs, in families, and other institutions to forge survival strategies and articulate themselves as persons of value. I asked how these are gendered and age-based processes by comparing the life stories of men and women of various ages with disabilities. Looking at the broader context, I noted with concern the consolidation of the disability rights movement in Ukraine under one powerful political figure, an arrangement that facilitated streamlining of priorities and process and certainly got things done, but also threatened to shut out alternative voices and ideas. Those seeking to launch competing or just alternate or parallel initiatives had difficulty securing political and financial support. Finally, I offered some suggestions for how the disability rights movement in Ukraine might secure broader social understanding and support to move beyond a niche issue to affect social consciousness. I suggested strategies for personalizing disability and the disability experience. Through some of the following: social advertising, first-person narratives in the mass media, and events designed to bring the disabled and non-disabled together in informal social settings. And I pointed out that important progress in legislation and enforcement was being implemented by activists elected to political office. So I encouraged more activists to seek positions in city and regional governments to advance the disability rights agenda. In this talk, I would like to offer an update on how struggles for disability rights have evolved in Ukraine during the last several years, including during the armed conflict with Russia. As an anthropologist, I think that one of the best ways to track a movement's success is to engage with people's experiences in and of that movement and its effects on their lives. I will do this today by tracking the ongoing life trajectories of several of the disability rights activist heroes of my 2011 book. And this is based on follow-up interviews that I did this past summer, and so I'll offer several "Where Are They Now" snapshots. And I want to ask whether people with disabilities in Ukraine are still mobile citizens making successful claims for individual and collective rights in this, frankly, war-torn country that is in deep economic, social, and political crisis. So let me start by offering a very brief snapshot of disability, the sort of current landscape of disability in Ukraine today. It is estimated that there are approximately 2.7 million people in Ukraine, which is roughly 6% of the population living with disabilities. We don't actually know how many disabled veterans there are returning from the conflict in eastern Ukraine. I've not been able to find any numbers. If anyone has numbers, please, please, please share them with me. But it's my sense that disabled vets definitely number in the thousands. At least 60,000 people with disabilities have been displaced to other areas of Ukraine from the occupied territories in Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. And there are probably as many as 300,000 people with disabilities still living in the conflict and occupied zones. The movement for disability rights in Ukraine is a countrywide movement. So you see lots of city-based, regional, and national organizations for disability issues all over the country. There are hundreds of civic organizations advocating for disability rights. Some of these are grassroots, non-governmental organizations, but many are hybrid organizations that really represent a kind of state, non-state partnership. And this arrangement, the kind of state, non-state partnership, is true of Ukraine's biggest disability rights coalition, the National Assembly of People with Disabilities of Ukraine. It's usually referred to as the Assembly, or NOW in AIU. I call it NADU for the English acronym. NADU is a huge coalition of around 29 national or all-Ukrainian disability rights NGOs and 88 regional organizations of people with disabilities. The Assembly was founded and continues to be headed by Valery Sushkevich. Sushkevich, a polio survivor, has held several important governmental posts during the last few years, including head of the National Paralympic Committee. To my knowledge, he is the first and only person with a serious disability to be elected as a people's deputy in the Ukrainian parliament, a post he held for many years. And currently, Sushkevich is the commissioner for the rights of disabled people in Ukraine. In this capacity, he serves as a direct advisor to the president of Ukraine on disability issues. Ukraine does have comprehensive disability rights legislation, and according to some accounts, I've not verified these, but many activists in Ukraine tell me that, in fact, their disability legislation is more comprehensive than that enjoyed by people in the United States. However, enforcement is a completely different issue. I see lots of nodding heads here. And in the decades of Ukrainian independence, the government has really put very few resources into reforms that would substantially improve the lives of many people with disabilities. Most government financial efforts towards disability have been put into social payments, not into systemic or infrastructural changes, and not into enforcement of the existing laws. However, there are a great many projects that have been initiated and implemented, many times with the partnership of international donors, foreign governments, NGOs from European countries in particular. And key focus areas of these projects have been accessible infrastructure, including the built environment and transportation, inclusive education for children and young adults with disabilities, a practice that's called active rehabilitation of people with disabilities, including early intervention for children with disabilities, and reforms in physical therapy practice. However, despite years of work in these areas, and I want to emphasize progress has been made, but it's been made oftentimes at the local level, and it's been made kind of in dribs and drabs, in short spurts. But there has been definite progress. So there are what I call isolated local victories, right? A few more accessible buses dispatched in this or that city, a couple of children with disabilities being integrated into a regular school, a couple of young people with disabilities going to get a higher education. There is a new rehab facility, I'll show pictures of it in a minute, for people with spinal cord injuries that's been built in the Carpathian Mountains. That's wonderful. However, it also, it's in some ways it's only making up the loss of one of the two such facilities that existed in Ukraine, one of which was in Saki in Crimea, which is now not Ukraine, right? So there were two existing such institutions. One is no longer in Ukraine, so a new one was built. So it's not necessarily a net gain, is what I'm saying. But change has not come nearly as quickly and has not reached nearly as many people with disabilities as was envisioned by enthusiastic activists in the early days of Ukrainian independence. That's the landscape. Before I get ahead of myself, let me delve into some of those snapshots, right? The where are they now stories that I wanted to share with you. So what I'm sort of focusing on right now is what has happened in the last 5 to 10 years. I did the research for the book really starting in 2002 all the way up to 2009. And so basically 2009, 2010 was where the action in the book stopped. And so for the last 5 years, I wanted to update you on some of the heroes from the book. I'll just let you read this poem by Zoya, who is one of the key social activists for disability rights who figured in my book. And in fact, before the talk, someone was asking me, how did I sort of switch from the topic of women's social activism in Ukraine to disability rights in Ukraine? And it's all thanks to Zoya. It was her inspiration. She figured heavily in the first book on women social activists, and she integrated me into the disability rights community and ended up steering me into this research line. So chapter 1 of my book was titled A Parallel World, a reference to how many people with disabilities in Ukraine and other post-socialist countries talked about the social isolation they experienced in their daily lives. They talked about being a person with a disability as living in a parallel world that most people never see and don't know anything about. The chapter focused on the life history of Sasha, who became a tetraplegic, meaning he was paralyzed basically from the neck down, after breaking his neck in 1991 at the age of 16. Sasha's mother, Zoya, was an important character in this study. And looking back, it's not at all surprising that I profiled this mother-son pair because, to be brutally honest, most young people with injuries like Sasha's do not survive. So he would not have survived his ordeal without the strong support of someone like his mother, who gave up her career, gave up her job, completely changed her life, started an NGO for people with spinal cord injuries, and became one of the founders of the disability rights movement. So she had founded one of the first disability advocacy organizations, and she fully admitted that she founded this group for Sasha's survival. She said, I founded this for my son, and in the meantime, other people benefited, and that's wonderful. So the organization, which I called Lotus, had several foci when I began getting to know Sasha and Zoya, and I actually I met them in 1999 for the first time. They provided kind of on-site initial support and mentorship for people who had just experienced spinal cord injury, so they did a lot of hospital visits with newly injured folks. They provided lots of informational resources, lots of networking opportunities, lots of information about how you reach out to different humanitarian groups, how you reach out to government services, how you reach out to healthcare providers, and things like that. They got very involved in the whole manufacturing and distribution of so-called active wheelchairs. So for Ukraine, a new type of lightweight wheelchair that's much easier to maneuver, particularly for women, I have to say. Not the clunky old-style wheelchairs, but new, more modern wheelchairs that really facilitated more independent movement and independent living for people with disabilities. So they made great strides actually in getting those locally produced at a former vacuum cleaner factory in Kiev. And they were very involved in kind of anti-stigma campaigns. So Zoya's her big thing was always trying to get young people, especially with disabilities, to get out in public. Don't be embarrassed. Don't worry about what people, say about you. They're not going to change their minds until they meet a real live disabled person, right? So you have to get out there and put yourself out there and change social attitudes and overturn that discrimination. So, unfortunately, by the time my study was kind of wrapping up 10 years later, right, in 2009, this organization, Lotus, was really kind of stalling out. I do think that Zoya was instrumental in mentoring a new generation of disability activists, but many of them ended up going into business, going into other endeavors, kind of getting out of political activism, and so she was a little disappointed, I would say, in her trainees, right? She felt like she had raised these people that were going to replace her in the movement, and then it turned out they had other ideas about what they wanted to do with their lives. And I noticed that Sasha, and I talked about this in the book, he started spending more and more of his time online, and he talked a lot about how he spent a lot of time actually in Second Life. I don't know if you know about this alternate, I don't even know how to talk about it, sort of an alternate reality that's online. And so I wondered at the end of the book, is he sort of jumping into or sort of seeping into a kind of alternate reality, and he's kind of detaching from quote unquote real world, although I understand that the virtual world for many people is just as real as the real world. That's a false dichotomy. So I could tell they were stalling out, and I was really curious what was going to happen, right, to this organization that had been so vibrant. So I saw Zoya and Sasha this summer, and I have to say, both of them had experienced really very difficult health problems in the last few years. They articulated in very direct terms that they were limiting their participation in disability rights issues because it had compromised their health. They said, when we go out and leave the house and participate, the long-term health consequences for us are more severe than we are willing to kind of risk. It's not worth it, basically. The payoff is not worth our participation. So they do some consultations by telephone. The web continues to be an important source. I think Sasha continues to spend a lot of his time online. But they really said, the way that we put ourselves out there and so strenuously gave ourselves to disability rights politics has compromised our health. Zoya actually told me, she said, I need surgery, but I will not have surgery because if something were to happen to me on that surgical table, I don't know what would happen to my son. And he's a young man. I mean, he's in his late 30s now, but she still feels like she is his main source of support, and she's definitely his main caregiver. So, what are some takeaways from this mother-son pair? And I should actually point out this is the entrance to their apartment building. Right after Sasha's injury, his father crafted this homemade wheelchair ramp over the stairs that go up. You see many examples like this in Ukraine. This has not changed since 1999 when I first met these folks. I just took this picture this summer and wanted to point that out. So one of the key takeaways is really the extent to which poor health and lack of adequate health care has compromised these leading activists. And I want to stress that these are people who are very well entrenched in the healthcare system, right? They've been doing this for a long time. They have all the connections you would think one would need to get really good health care. Frankly, they also are economically pretty okay. I mean, they're not rich by any means, but Zoya has been a little bit entrepreneurial in her activism, and so they live an okay life. So, nevertheless, they really have this terribly compromised access to adequate health care. And they're living isolated in their apartment. And I found this really ironic, too, because Zoya, as at the forefront as she always was of the destigmatization campaign, she said, I don't want to go outside because I don't want people to see me like this. You know, she kind of hobbles around. She uses two canes. She's bent over, and I was really surprised that this woman that had spent so many years telling people, just get out there, says that she herself is embarrassed about her appearance. So that's one profile. Let me move on to another one. Dimitri, in my book, was an aging quadriplegic athlete, and I profiled him as a disabled man negotiating gender role expectations and articulating himself as a masculine and sexual being. He was a charismatic and controversial figure in the disability rights movement. He was the leader of an organization for youth with disabilities. He had great Paralympic potential, and the Paralympic sort of movement and the Paralympic Games is one of the sort of main areas in Ukraine where people with disabilities have been really, really visible and successful. Despite his great athletic potential, he never became a Paralympic athlete on the national level because he did not get along with the chair of the Paralympic committee. So there were lots of kind of personal issues going on there. I followed Dimitri and his youth organization in the book, and I documented how he organized some really unorthodox events for young people with disabilities on the streets of Kiev. Some, frankly, really bizarre and strange events, but they were wonderful in that they were opportunities for young people who were wheelchair users or were on crutches or had other disabilities to sort of put themselves out there in the middle of the city and actually meet, interact with just passersby. So it was a great opportunity for people passing by in sort of the holiday mood on Khreshchatyk, which is the main thoroughfare in Kiev, on the weekends, to interact with people with disabilities and meet them as fellow human beings, right? Not as a stereotype, not as a really sad story that you see on TV on a Sunday afternoon or something like that. So they were bizarre but wonderful events. Dimitri was and is extremely charismatic. So he had always been encouraged to go into politics, like to run for office. He planned to do that several times, but for a variety of reasons, it never worked out for him to actually run for political office. I've kept in touch with Dimitri ever since the initial field work, and he's done a lot of wheeling and dealing. He's quite a character. Unfortunately, the wheeling and dealing backfired, and he ended up in a sort of scheme, which happens a lot in Eastern Europe, losing his apartment, unbeknownst to him, supposedly, signing his apartment over to someone else. So he lost his very nice two-room apartment in Kiev, and subsequently had to move to a village several hours' drive away from Kiev, a village of just 47 people. So we would really call it a huter, like really small village, teeny tiny village. And this is a guy who's always been a city liver, right? I found out that his youth organization, he basically admitted that his youth organization has become a front for getting humanitarian aid. So he has cut some deals with some folks in Kiev that the youth organization signs off for 10 tons of humanitarian aid. 9 tons goes somewhere, I know not where, and Dimitri gets 1 ton of humanitarian aid, which he distributes as he sees fit. This is a wonderful way for him to ingratiate himself with his neighbors in the village, right? He's become a popular guy. I don't know what else he does with the humanitarian aid. He says he doesn't sell it. But, he relies on mutually beneficial deals like this and mutually beneficial relationships for his survival. I visited I call it the homestead. I visited his homestead in the village. These are a few shots from it. You can't really get the whole picture of what this place looks like, but it's one main house and a summer kitchen and a bunch of barns and outbuildings. And it's hilarious because there are decorations. You see over here this sort of macrame purse and a hat and a scarf. This is all humanitarian aid that didn't get distributed, or that nobody wanted, or that they just thought would make a cute decoration. So the whole place is decorated with like cast-offs, children's toys, crazy looking clothes that nobody wanted. So it's a real kind of carnivalesque feel when you enter this homestead. I don't know if you can see up on the hill in that grass, that's actually a broken down wheelchair. So you're sort of greeted as you sort of come into his domain by this broken down wheelchair. It's very symbolic, right? But it's very playful. It's up on top of a hill. It's kind of like a lounge chair. It could function as a lounge chair, a lawn chair. Really interesting. Also really retro stuff, right? This old TV that was, who would give a TV from the 50s as humanitarian aid? I don't know. Somebody did, and here it is. This old telephone, from the olden days. So, interesting decor. So, going back to survival strategies. There is a guy who lives with Dimitri who otherwise would be homeless and has been homeless for many of the last 10 years, who basically acts as his assistant. Does things for him physically, mostly around the homestead. This is this guy. He is really interesting. He considers himself to be a shaman. So in his barn, he has all of these musical instruments, all of these sort of New Age tapestries, all kinds of New Age accoutrements around the barn, some homemade drums and things that he's made. So he has little seances in his barn, kind of in the middle of the night. It's really a cool place to be, I have to say. But it's kind of like this space that's outside reality. So I've really been trying to grapple with how to understand this homestead that Dimitri has put together. So this is just my sort of initial attempt to do so. Here we have a guy who has thrived on sociality his whole life, cast out to the periphery, right? Left to fend for himself. I should note that inside his living space, the walls are adorned with images of his past glory. So he has images of his old athletic achievements, medaling ceremonies. He used to do wheelchair dance, and he was pretty big in the wheelchair dance world. So fabulous portraits of himself, decked out doing wheelchair dance. So there's a sense in which he recognizes what was lost, and that adorns the walls of his living space. So in theoretical terms, we might call Dimitri the very embodiment of Giorgio Agamben's Homo Sacer in the most basic terms, the so-called sacred man, included in the juridical order solely in the form of his exclusion, that is, of his capacity to be killed. In colloquial terms, though, we might say that Dimitri is a cat with 9 lives. I haven't talked a lot about his health problems, but he has serious health problems. Every time he's been diagnosed with liver cancer 2 years ago, he has not been treated, has not had surgery, drinks way too much, smokes way too much. Every time I see him, I think this is the last time I'm going to see this guy. You know, every time I leave a meeting with him, I don't know if I'll see him again. But he keeps coming back. Thank God. And an interesting thing is he absolutely and fully recognizes the precarity of his situation, right? He doesn't think things are okay, but he laughs at it. And you can see that in this homestead. Okay, so that's Dimitri. Sorry, I got ahead of myself. One last really brief update, snapshot, and then I want to talk about what all of this means. What kind of trends are we seeing? So I began the conclusion chapter of my book with the life story of Pasha, who in 1998, at the age of 19, experienced a spinal cord injury when he fell out of a hayloft. Having planned to become an engineer like his parents, Pasha, now a wheelchair user, studied economics at a small university near his village home, mostly through correspondence courses. The local social welfare office had promised him a job upon graduation, but reneged when he came to them with his diploma and said, "I'd like my job now." Even having obtained a university degree, Pasha was continually frustrated in his attempts to find work, a very common experience. And he actually moved all over the country looking for work. There'd be a lead over here in this city, and he'd go there and follow up on that lead, no dice. Same thing happened over and over again. And I actually traveled with him on some of these sort of employment quests. In the book, I described how Pasha's close ones, including his former best friend and several advocates, made a conscious decision to withdraw their support to help him become, they said, to help him become more independent. They had begun to see him as kind of a hanger-on, I'm sorry to say. This was really hard to watch, and I described Pasha's predicament as indicative of some of the dehumanizing effects of democratization in Ukraine, with its neoliberal logics emphasizing independence, self-reliance, and self-centered strategies for life improvement. The tragedy here is the crevice between such empowerment narratives that promote self-sufficiency and individual independence and a lack of adequate state and community supports to facilitate such self-possession. The last time I saw Pasha in person, in 2006, he had no job, no girlfriend, no permanent place to live, and no real plan. He lamented, "Sarah, what's wrong with me? Why am I still alone?" And I have to point out that I tried to think of some graphic that would encapsulate Pasha and his situation, and I could not find one. So what I need is a blank slide up here because I just don't know what visual would do it justice. Maybe you can help me, Jessica. So what happened to Pasha, really quickly? So basically, he went through a string of marriages and relationships, interestingly. Some of these were a little bit unorthodox. One of his wives was very young, and everybody commented on how very, very young his wife was. None of these relationships worked out, and he kind of bounced back and forth between different women and their families. He never found a permanent job. He did a little bit of web work. He had a kind of mental breakdown after one of his relationships failed, and he sought refuge in a monastery. He lived in a monastery for about 3 weeks, and that seemed to help him sort of come back. Here's the interesting part. When the war began in eastern Ukraine, Pasha was offered work as a psychotherapist and rehab specialist in a hospital in the east of Ukraine, serving wounded veterans and the local population, especially older people. It's not clear if he works for the separatist side or the Ukrainian side, and I heard both versions. I called Pasha on the phone to see what I could find out. I didn't ask him directly, what side are you working for? But my impression was that it's the separatist side. And he didn't want to talk much on the phone. And this is true not only with me, but with his former friends. He's become really difficult to contact and very distant. And kind of elusive. And it's almost like he's turned the tables and he's saying, I don't need you people anymore. You worked so hard for me to become independent. Here I am. I'm not going to tell you what I'm doing. It's not your business. Kind of a defiant, attitude that here I am, now I'm independent. It's unfortunate that independence maybe could only happen, in this kind of the extreme conditions of a war zone for someone like Pasha. So that's something to think about. So what are some conclusions that we can draw from these where are they now snapshots? One major conclusion is that there appears to be a generational crisis in the movement. This fellow on the right is Jaroslav He's from the city of Lviv. He's one of the founders of the disability rights movement. I interviewed him this summer, and he said, I look behind me and I don't see the next generation of activists coming up. This is actually a picture taken at a symposium in Toronto recently. This is a very, these two, Oksana and Mikkola are again founders of the parents movement for parents with disabilities in Ukraine. They immigrated to Toronto a couple of years ago and are greatly missed in the movement. And also talked about how there doesn't seem to be a new generation of activists coming up. In connection with the war, a couple of new initiatives have emerged, but not to the extent that one would expect. There are some exceptions to this generational crisis. This is a young activist, Tatiana Borantsova, that I've been working with in Kiev. She's originally from Luhansk, but she's been very active with youth with disabilities in particular, sort of trying to carry on the work. Health crises, I found, again, in all these follow-up interviews, that people really talked about the terrible health crises that they're having. This is partly because these are people with disabilities who are more prone to have, particular health problems, but it's also indicative of the lack of healthcare reform in Ukraine over the past 25 years and the really not very great state of healthcare, and particularly accessibility to healthcare. So if state healthcare is nominally free, in practice, it is definitely a for-pay system, and you have to pay for absolutely everything. Any kind of nursing care, any kind of care, you have to pay either above the table or under the table. So that was a real narrative thread in people's narratives, was we have no good access to health care. Even healthcare providers themselves who got sick complained about not having access to health care. This is the new facility for rehabilitation for people with spinal cord injuries that I mentioned, that has been built in the Carpathian Mountains in Modrici. I have not been there. I would love to visit the place and see what it's like. The healthcare crisis has been catastrophic for the war wounded as well. Ukraine does not have the capacity to deal with the multiply injured and the devastatingly injured, and these vets are sent to Poland, Germany, and Sweden for treatment. Those that stay have a really difficult time getting their disability benefits, getting access to good treatment and therapy. And NGOs and private entities appear to be the main drivers of healthcare for the war wounded in Ukraine, not the state. Some old facilities are being repurposed, so facilities for Chernobyl victims or veterans of World War II are being repurposed for treatment for the newer war vets, but it's nowhere near to keeping up with demand. These are a few other trends. I'll try to go very quickly through them. Before the war, there was a great deal of cooperation between disability rights organizations in Ukraine and in Russia. To some extent, that's been compromised. Not surprising, right, by the war, but it is very, very unfortunate. Unfortunately, in contrast to 10 years ago, today there are no major disability rights activists currently in political office. There are some that are on various advisory committees. I mentioned Sushkevich's position as direct advisor to the president on disability issues, so that's very important. But if you go back, these two folks, these two guys, Jaroslav and Mikkola, they were both in the city government in Lviv and had really focused their energies on enforcement of legislation and really were getting things done in Lviv. Jaroslav told me, he said, I was successfully not reelected, meaning he was kind of done. He was kind of over politics and wasn't that disappointed that he wasn't reelected to city government, but it sure was a loss for the disability rights movement. And of course, Mikkola, having immigrated, is not in the city government anymore either. And we don't see a significant increase in political will to address disability issues. And this really became obvious when I sort of tried to track what response the state was taking to the displacement of more than 60,000 people with disabilities from Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast. And the state response was lackluster by any standards, I would say. The consolidation of the movement under one leader and one coalition continues to have mixed results. This is not surprising either, right? When you have a coalition, coalition building, you know, it's healthy for getting legislation and policies adopted at the national level. Sometimes initiatives that are born at the grassroots can actually find their way up through the sort of avenues of power in coalitions and be implemented on a national level instead of just a local level. But on the other hand, this kind of consolidation also sometimes squeezes out alternative voices, right? And we see this kind of streamlining in other areas. In the HIV research that I've been doing, it's kind of a similar situation in that HIV prevention basically is funded by one international organization in Ukraine. Many of the NGOs that we work with, 100% of their funding comes from the Global Fund. And so there's not a lot of alternative. There has been limited but some progress in accessibility of transport and the built environment. I also noticed more social advertising in Ukraine. So I was on the train, and you know, the sort of give you little roliki, little things to watch while you're on the train. And several of those actually on the fast train from Kiev to Lviv were about disability issues. One was an informational video, very well done, about why do people who have mobility disabilities actually need a special parking space, right? Why is it important that you don't park there? Sort of really basic educational things about accessibility and special needs. And another one was about inclusive education. It was a little profile of a little girl who's blind. She was talking about how she wants to go to regular school, how much she likes it, and why it's important for her to go to regular school. So well done little informational social ads in places like trains. And I also saw some billboards about disability rights. One thing that I think is really important is if you followed the Euromaidan protests, you know that it's been called by many people a revolution of dignity, and this idea of dignity or chidnost came out of those protests, and this discourse of dignity is something that the disability rights movement has really latched onto, and I think that's great, and I saw it coming out in people's narratives as well. So that's one positive development, and there are more, because in many ways, you know, I've painted a rather bleak picture, but I want to sort of turn around now and say there has been progress made. It's not the progress that people envisioned back in the early 90s when there was so much energy around disability rights, so much energy was put into rights initiatives. But there has been some progress. This is Uliana Pcholkina, who has really brought a lot of visibility to disability issues. She wears many hats. She is an activist. She runs an organization on disability issues. She's a trainer in the active rehabilitation movement that I was talking about. She's also an athlete. She does karate. And she's really done a lot to improve the image of people with disabilities for the general public. So I sort of took these, I got all these from Facebook. Facebook's great because you can find find lots of images and feel like you have permission to use them because they're on Facebook after all, right? And so I show this to show how she can sort of engage with other rights issues, right? She has a public platform to engage with a range of issues. So this is one of her at work on the left. The second picture says, I'm going to a charity bazaar. Come with me, right? Come to the charity bazaar. The next one says, I'm for peace. And the next one says, I support Kiev Pride. So, right, she's engaging with rights issues sort of across the spectrum. If you'll indulge me, I wanted to really quickly show you a video of Uliana.
Мене звати Уляна Пчолкіна. В 21 рік я потрапила у інвалідний візок. Але це не завадило мені стати чемпіонкою світу з карате, громадським діячем та вдало вийти заміж. А зовсім нещодавно я почала працювати телеведучою на каналі, який стрімко набирає обертів в інформаційному просторі. Ти досі скиглиш? Ти досі не віриш в свої сили? Так от я скажу тобі. У тебе є 2 руки, 2 ноги, а головне – голова на плечах. Інвалідний візок змінив моє життя, але навчив мене одному – ніколи, чуєш, ніколи не здаватись.
So she's a news announcer on News One. I apologize, there weren't subtitles there, but basically she's encouraging others who have had spinal cord injuries or for whatever reason are using a wheelchair not to give up. And she talks about the successes she's had. She says you have 2 legs, you have 2 arms, you have a head on your shoulders. You know, don't give up. So that is one very positive development. Another very interesting initiative, I'll just leave it like this, is this photo shoot. I don't know if this has come through Ann Arbor. It came through Toronto. I just missed it when I was there for a symposium earlier this year, but it's a photo shoot called The Victors by Alexander Murderer of the Ukrainian war vet amputees. And it developed into this exhibition at the Taras Shevchenko Museum in Kiev, and now it's traveling internationally. But it's empowering creative photographs of wounded vets, all of them amputees, from the war zone, and it's in the Ukrainian context. This is very revolutionary, right? It's very revolutionary to put your body out there as a different body, as a damaged body, particularly when you're a man, right? And so there's all kinds of gender kind of issues coming in here, but it's intended to be an empowering exhibition and a new way of articulating disability as something that maybe is not as limiting as people might construe it to be. It can be a source of pride, empowerment, a source of new positive identity. So this is a really interesting initiative as well. Another one is this campaign called Coffee with a Friend. I'm going to show you a little clip about this, which is in English, but this is kind of a creative thing that emerged, again, as a way for regular people to be able to meet and get to know real live people with disabilities, right, as fellow humans on a human level. So I want to quickly show this. one.
A social media campaign is taking off in Ukraine, all thanks to a young man who turned a negative experience into something positive. Roman Kislyak is the advocate behind the Coffee with a Friend movement, aimed to change public perceptions about people with disabilities.
I want to make sure children with disabilities don't suffer because of people's Soviet mentality.
The campaign is also gaining ground in the capital city of Kyiv. Alexei Krasnoshakov, a disability rights advocate who now works with the veterans of the war in Ukraine, says people are slowly changing, but it is still a work in progress.
Unfortunately, people with disabilities are still viewed as somewhat of an attraction. This, of course, stirs up negative tendencies, but I think once more attention is brought to this issue and the society starts to form their own thoughts and opinions, people will become more civilized.
In today's Ukraine, public views are improving, but disability rights activists say many are afraid of what the society may think of them. Alexei underlines the importance of being involved and striving for changing those perceptions instilled during the Soviet times.
So I want to point out actually that the guy they showed at the end who founded pidmoha.org is one of the main, yes, oh, sorry, sorry. Thank you. Okay, thanks. He founded this organization as a way to get prosthetics for war amputees. He himself is not a war amputee, but he is an amputee, and he recognized how difficult veterans coming back from the conflict in eastern Ukraine, how difficult it was for them to get appropriate prosthetics. And so he has founded this very vibrant organization. Again, a civic initiative, right, to do what many would say is the state's responsibility to provide prosthetics to war vets. Also, the video didn't mention that Roman Kislyak, the guy who founded this Coffee with a Friend campaign, actually it all started because he was kicked out of a cafe in Lviv. He came in, I think he has cerebral palsy, and he was denied service in that cafe. So he started this campaign, which has gotten a lot of attention. So, what are recommendations? What do we do? Whoops. Sorry. Based on these follow-ups and based on these kinds of snapshots, these would be some of my recommendations. Many of them are very similar to the ones that I made in the book. So again, I think getting people with disabilities and their advocates in positions of political power at whatever level that is, whether it's the city, whether it's the regional, whether it's the national, is really crucial, particularly in terms of enforcement. Much easier said than done, right? That's a very difficult recommendation to implement, but we've seen how it was important and effective, 5 years ago. So if it could be done again, it would be great. Introducing disability studies into university curricula. Again, this has happened in dribs and drabs. This has been happening in certain institutions in Ukraine, in curricula of social work, physical therapy, sometimes medicine, sometimes education, law. Some activists have really tried to get disability issues included into the curricula. I think insider journalism and getting a positive kind of presence in the media is still really important. That's why I'm excited about some of these initiatives that I just described. So much that's written about disability still in places of the world like Ukraine is not from an insider's perspective, right? It uses disempowering, dehumanizing language. It focuses on kind of pity and tugging at your heartstrings type of stories, and it's not from the insider perspective and from people with disabilities themselves. So I think a lot could be done in the area of journalism. I have been surprised, and not surprised on the other hand, that there's not more of a disabled veterans movement in Ukraine. I fully understand people are focused on survival, right? It's a very, very difficult situation in the country right now, economically, politically, socially, and it's a burden placed on people who are experiencing trauma to expect them to become self-advocates and then advocates for others. But I think if there were more of a disability rights movement from the veterans, from that young segment, right, of society, and if they could somehow plug in to the energy that used to be around disability issues, that we might see some reforms. And I hope that folks will continue to seize on this dignity discourse, because, I mean, people are still kind of riding the waves of the Euromaidan, even if it's become rather, can I say this, people are more and more disillusioned that the so-called revolution didn't bring about the kinds of reforms they hoped it would. But still, right, you still see lots of volunteerism that emerged from the Maidan. You still see this discourse of dignity that can really, I think, stimulate more activism, more sort of cross-issue movement collaborations. So thank you so much for your attention. I've really enjoyed sharing this with you, and I'd love to take your questions and comments.
About 20 minutes for questions and comments. I'll take a I'll sit there so that I can see everyone. Just raise your hand and I will write, that you want to speak when I tell you may speak. So Donna will have a microphone that she will bring to you. If you wouldn't mind just saying your name so that Sarah knows who you are, and be brief in your question or comment so that as in people can participate. So, okay, I'm starting to take a cue. Deborah? Julie?
See you there. Hi, nice to see you not on Skype.
Hi, Deborah.
It's good to see. I'm Deborah Jones. I'm in anthropology. I also work in Ukraine. I just wanted to ask you if you could elaborate a little bit on how you understand the dignity discourse, and also as you were speaking, I've been trying to sort of figure out, where does dignity intersect with these other discourses about Soviet mentality and self-reliance, but also where does dignity intersect with freedom or mobility, independence, as maybe it was understood at the time you were writing the book, and has that changed?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's one that I definitely want to address as I sort of write this preface. I'm thinking out loud here, and I'll continue to think more about it, but I'll tell you how the people I talked to this summer used the dignity discourse, and it was in the context of being able to take the train and be mobile and work, go to work every day, do the things that needed to be done to be a normal human being, just like other people. And so it was specifically in response to accessible trains, and how having to use trains that were not wheelchair accessible, that one could not access independently, was a violation of one's dignity, because you had to ask for help, you had to be carried, you had to, people staring at you, why are people carrying that grown man onto a train, right? A violation of my dignity. So it's also, I got to think about this more, but in a way, it's about bodies and personal space, too, in this context. But it definitely was about doing things independently in a way that others do, and that's what lends me dignity as a person with a disability. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as well. Yeah, thank you.
So we have...
Hello.
Julie, and then next is you. Yeah, you were number 7. So I think one, yes. So one thing I think we're going to take 3 questions at a time so that you have,
Okay.
and you respond because
Yeah.
you're already number 7, you're number 6, you're number 8. So.
Hello, I'm Jody Gregg from
Hi.
the Slavic department. I work in Poland.
Hi, Jody.
I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on, you touched on it a little bit within the talk, but this idea of cross-movement solidarity or integration amongst particularly like queer LGBT rights, feminist groups. I've seen a little bit of this effort in feminist groups in Poland in the last 5 or 6 years, and I was just wondering if that is a strong trend amongst these groups in Ukraine.
Okay.
Thank you. Hi for everybody. I'm Tatiana Nicholson. I'm PhD psychologist. I just arrived from Ukraine. I am only 3 weeks here. So, and I am the head of a whole Ukrainian non-government organization. And one of the point which my organization is doing is helping people with difficult life situation. So I just want to make a small comment that during last 5-6 years, situation with people with disability is really changed. We have now a lot of new infrastructure for this kind of people. I can't say that it's in all cities in Ukraine, but for example, in city Vinnytsia it is. In city Khmelnytsk it's also better infrastructure. And about next generation of activists, I want to tell you that they are growing, and if you need contacts of new non-government organization with young people with disability, I can give it to you.
Great. I'm glad to hear it. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Laura. I'm a student at Ross at the MBA in the MBA program. My question was if you could extrapolate just a little bit more about some of these like leftover Soviet attitudes or mentalities that were mentioned in the in one of the YouTube videos. I just don't have some of the context, and maybe bringing that to light could be helpful for some of us.
Sure. Yeah. Yes. I'll start with that one, actually, the historical one. Yes, so there's actually been quite a bit written about disability, and more than that, the denial of the existence of disability and people with disabilities in the Soviet Union. And so, long story short, it was considered that the existence of people with disabilities was an anathema, right, to the whole sort of socialist experiment and building this new society, with some exceptions, right? And so there was really a practice of warehousing people with serious disabilities and, shutting people out in institutions that were sort of far away from cities and things like that. There's this quote from one of the early disability rights activists, Valery Fefyolov, there are no invalids in the USSR. Reportedly, this is what some official said at the Olympic Games in like the 80s. And so there's this history, right, of stigmatization, of discrimination, of isolation, and we didn't see the kind of integrative efforts until very recently that we have seen in other Western contexts with deinstitutionalization, community supports, right, and family-based care to the extent as possible for people with disabilities. So that's sort of the long, the short story of the long story. About cross-movement solidarity, the people that I know in Ukraine have not engaged in a lot of that. I think there was a hope that with the Maidan, that kind of cross-issue solidarity might emerge. The disability organizations that I have worked with and sort of have followed were not central players in the Maidan and weren't really connected to that whole kind of phenomenon. And so I have not seen a lot of cross-solidarity movement. I wish I could say that I had seen. If folks know more about kinds of cross-solidarity collaborations, I'd love to hear about it, because I think it would be a really, really good thing all the way around for different rights movements that are trying to gain some traction. Yeah.
The last person, may I comment?
Oh yes, about the new generation. Wonderful. I'm I'm very glad to hear it. And I do know that there it's not like nobody's around and nobody's doing anything. And I know that the Assembly also, continues its work, and there are a lot of these regional organizations, many of them that are focused on youth, that are taking part and are members of the Assembly and things like that. So it's great. I also, people also talk about the younger generation as being kind of more entrepreneurial, more, into sort of the economic reality of Ukraine today. And these sort of older activists feel like the younger ones tend to get distracted. It might just be grumpy old people talking, right? Now, I'm sort of middle-aged and I'm sort of like, oh, young people today. So, there's probably part of that, I'm sure. But I'd love to connect with you and learn more about your organization and the folks that you work with.
First, I wanted to thank you, Sarah, for the nice. My name is Irina Bondarenko. I'm a statistician at the School of Public Health at the University of Michigan. And thank you for the nice talk. It was very moving to hear all the story and, to see some trends. Me and my friends were doing some field work in Ukraine, trying to help some disability groups and disability centers. And I know from talking to them and from their experience, they're thriving from learning from other communities, from other countries. And I was thinking about partnership, of partnering them with some similar organization in the United States and in Europe.
Yeah.
And talking about solidarity across the movements. I think if I would really would like to see it happening, because with feminist movements, because many of the many main caregivers, they're just mothers, of the children, because many families just split after a child with disabilities is born.
Right.
So I just would like to hear your perspective. What do you know about what's happening in this area? About partnership.
Yes. Thank you.
Sarah here. Oksana Poza, Ukrainian Women's League of America. We've been working with Irina Bondarenko with the Center for Disabled Children in Romny, very wonderful activists there. It's actually all stemmed out from the Open World program that probably a couple dozen of Ukrainian social workers, including those people we met who are handicapped themselves, came to Detroit through International Council of Detroit, and they were shown around and taught a lot, and so I'm sure they carried that back. So this is all on the local level and the personal experience, personal efforts. Can you tell us if you found in your extensive travels, of course, in communications, if you found any government, state-level governments that interest responsible people, somebody in charge there who has a plan, long-term plan? Have they drawn on your research and research? And is anybody you would send your new book in Russian after it's translated? Can somebody benefit from it and drive it back from the top? Because the You understand that all this humanitarian aid can be squandered away pretty easily, but on the government level, with the anti-corruption measures, hopefully taking effect, so there will be much more powerful potential from the government. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, my name is Els Nieuwenhuizen. I'm originally Dutch, and I've been working for years in the field of disability and currently retired from the Department of Rehabilitation. My first question is the United Nations Rights for People with Disability. You're familiar with that?
Yes.
Then? The first sentence is also to recognize the inherent right and inherent worth and dignity of every person. So it comes back to the question of dignity. Has that been signed by Russian?
Yes.
So they are ahead of the United States?
Yes, yes. The
That's
U.S.
very
has
good.
not signed, Ukraine has signed.
Yes, that's very good. They also use a very good definition in that United Nations rights, what's based on the World Health Organization classification. I know in your book you haven't mentioned that. Are you familiar with that classification?
No, I need to look into that. I mean, in the book I talk about how in Ukrainian legislation disability is defined. I didn't do a comparison with the UN definition. That would be that's a great topic to look at for
And
them.
you mentioned also 2.7 million people with disabilities. What is the percentage of the total population in Ukraine?
Roughly 6. And I know they say in most societies around 10%, right?
That's 5.
Oh, is it 5?
Yes, 5.
I've heard 10.
Depends,
so 6.
depends how you count.
Yeah.
But in the United States, we say it's 5.
Okay.
1 on
yeah.
20.
Yeah. In Ukraine, they say it's around 6.
Okay.
But again, statistics on disability are, I don't know how reliable. That you're the statistician, you should tell us.
It was hard to find any survey
Yeah.
in Ukraine, and disabilities.
Yes, it's very difficult to find numbers, and part of that is a legacy of the Soviet Union when people weren't counted, when the numbers were secretive.
We have one
Yes.
last question.
Okay.
And then we're finishing.
Okay.
My name is Bella Sherman, and I am a Russian and Ukrainian linguist. In fact, I have interpreted in the past for some of the open world delegations. My question is, you mentioned that survival often goes to the forefront of existence some of the organizations in terms of disability rights. How has it happened in terms of other organizations like women's rights and other movements? Has it affected it, and in what way from your experience?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Survival.
People pay more attention to their survival and trying to survive in the war zone rather than being involved in political movements.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Okay. Oh my goodness, so many wonderful questions. Where do I start? Okay. I love the idea of some feminist or women's rights or gender consciousness raising movements within or in connection to the disability rights movement, because it is so true that when you deinstitutionalize people with disabilities, particularly children with disabilities, and you task the family with caring for those children, 9 times out of 10, it's going to be the mother and other women in the family who are the caregivers. And those women need support, and they need to get together and think about, do we want to position ourselves as not only mothers, but as some other kind of agent? So I think that that is a wonderful, wonderful suggestion. I'm not aware of initiatives that have specifically tried to empower women as somehow connected with disability issues in the sense of caregiving, mothering, and things like that. I am aware of programs that have looked at women's reproductive health. And so I could go on and on about sort of the implications of why do we always think of women as reproducers, and the initiatives focus on their reproductive health, et cetera. So I'll think about that more. That's a great suggestion. yeah, interesting to think about who I would, if when the book's translated, who am I going to send it to? Obviously, first I will, so some of the people who figure in my study, the heroes, some of them have read parts of it. They sort of had informal translations done for themselves because they were really curious to know what I was saying in the book. But I would obviously send it to the people that it's about. But what sort of high-level, sort of state-level folks, I'd send it to the Assembly for sure. There are some great people at the Assembly, and I've worked with them. Again, not discounting the problems of sort of everything being consolidated into one sort of one institution. There, if you go to, I would say, if you're interested, and particularly if you read Ukrainian, I would suggest that you go to the naiu.org website and look at all of the initiatives that the Assembly is doing. There is an impressive array of initiatives, from inclusive education to social advertising to helping displaced people with disabilities from the war zone. There's a lot going on. I'm not, so there's quantity. I'm not sure how much depth there is in some of these programs, but they're more or less transparent. They publish a yearly report, an annual report every year about their activities, so you can see what's going on, and there are some really good people in the Assembly. I think is that all I have time for? Okay. Well, I'd love to speak more informally if folks have time. Also distribute my cards, and you can contact me by email. But thank you so much. It's been really stimulating, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thank you.